Today's lecture continues our previous conversation about the Abbasid aesthetics, the Islamic aesthetics, and its spread over the entire Dal al-Islam. So today we're going to look at the Fatimid and the Umayyad, the later phase of the Umayyad as it moved into Spain. So here we have the competing caliphates, a map. So the Abbasid, we were introduced last time. Remember, Umayyad, centered in Damascus and Jerusalem, was in power from approximately 650 to 750. Abbasid, here we have 749, continues with its capital in Baghdad, as we mentioned before. As you can see on the map, it is Iraq and the western half of Iran. But as we see, we also have competing caliphates. That whole concept of Dar al-Islam and the original spread of Abbasid all the way across the Mediterranean world obviously is being eroded with competing families, competing dynasties trying to ascend to power. So in this map, we see the Fatimid. The word is generally associated with Egypt. Extending all the way from Morocco, across Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and even into the Red Sea areas of Arabia, as well as up the Mediterranean to modern-day Israel, most of Syria, Lebanon, and most of Jordan. And then we also see on the far west side of the map the Umayyads. So a branch of the family did survive in Spain during this time period. So what we're going to see again today is the Abbasid aesthetic concepts that we looked at before simply being transmitted throughout the entire Islamic world. Today, obviously, focusing on the Mediterranean. So we'll begin with Cairo. So here we have Al-Azhar Mosque, and we can see many of the same issues from the Abbasid. We saw that mosque at Kairouan in Tunisia, Ibn Tulun. So here we see the same concept of the open courtyard, the colonnade, the rows of columns that provide the shelter, the shade for people coming to pray, shelter from the hot sun of this area of the world. And we also see applied decoration above those arches, slightly pointed arches that give a sense of repetition, a sense of geometric patterning. We also can see, even up along the edge line, the skyline, the reminiscence of that fortification type of fortress element. You have these many little pyramid forms that are projecting upwards from that roof line in a constant pattern. What I want you to look at in these examples is that sense of visual contrast. So with a minimum amount of design elements, minimum amount of shapes, minimum amount of colors, the architect, the designer is trying to create the maximum visual impact. So let's start at the bottom. So there we have the bright summer sun, and we have the dark recesses of those porches in the colonnades. So it is bright white, and then these lower value shaded areas. That creates a tremendous contrast because obviously the bright white comes towards us. It's a more visually powerful element. The shadowed areas recess inward. So it's a push-pull type of tension between bright white and dark shadowed areas. Then when we look at the level of the white wall surface above those arches, you have a circle, a pointed arch, circle, pointed arch, circle, pointed arch. There is a repetition of an AB, 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 and then the large, the entryway into the mosque itself. So if you look at the slides on the left, it's AB, 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 space, B, A, B, A, and on, until you get to the major doorways on the sides of the courtyards. In that case, your bright white wall where you have your circles as well as your arch shapes outlined in the darker color. So the white is added paint, and then the negative, the contrast color here is the actual color of the stone. Then we go up again, and when you look at those little pyramid fortress type shapes on the roof line, they also have a sense of dynamic visual interest. We see them silhouetted against the sky. So they represent the dark stone against the pale blue sky. So everything is in contrast. Everything is a juxtaposition, a counterpoise between A and B, between light and dark, between something solid and negative space, empty space. So it's like an opening and then a wall, something solid and then a window, something solid and the silhouette of the sky. So this creates, even as I said, with a very limited visual vocabulary, tremendous amount of activity. In this slide, obviously that is the minaret, and then we see one of the domes above one of the one of the building elements. So here we have a grander view of it. We see the sweeping area of the courtyard and the tremendous contrast between first floor, second floor, the various fortification elements. Then we have the minarets, and then we have the dome. Here we see it better, the dome that is above the Qibla wall, the mihrab arch. So here again, more of a detail. The variety of different levels and the different play of visual elements. There is a slight sense of repetition from first floor into second floor into the dome. So if we say the first floor, the first level are the arches, the porch, the shaded area. Look at the shape of that arch. It slowly angles inward and meets at a point. Then when you look at the second level, where you have circle, arch, circle, arch, circle, arch, those arches are a little narrower than what we see with the first floor, but they also come to a point. So on the second level, it's that combination of that circular, wider element with a narrower, more vertical pointed arch. Then when you look at the dome up above, it is that same combination. Maybe that dome looks more like the first floor arch in terms of its breadth. It's wide. It has a broad contour that comes to the point at the top. So very aesthetically sophisticated, and obviously it is geometry, patterning, mathematics that are the driving principles in much of this. So you have those geometric principles as well as high value, low value, brightly illuminated versus shadowed areas, a flat surface with a decorated surface, a flat wall surface with an opening, a recess. So it is at this time during the Fatimid that we have a greater elaboration of some of the elements within the mosque prayer hall, the assembly hall itself. So in this slide, we see two elements that we mentioned last class. On the left is the mihrab arch. So that's the Qibla wall. We're looking at the wall. When we face it, we're facing towards Mecca. And as we mentioned last time, again, the artist is using color contrast. High value, low value, bright and dark. The artist is using, in this case, we have greens, which are cool colors, with oranges and reds that are warmer colors. So you have this alternation of white with red, white with green, white with red, white with green, all the way across. There is a predictable rhythm from side to side as well as from the floor up into that arch. And again, as you see, the mihrab arch is mimicking the shape of those arches on the outside in that portico, in that porch area for the shade off of the side of the courtyard. So that's the mihrab arch, okay? It is a symbol, it is a metaphor pointing not just to Mecca, that is the Qibla wall, but is also metaphorically pointing upwards, vertically, the ascent of Muhammad up into the heavenly sphere. To the right of it is the minbar. We had that word last time. The minbar is the pulpit. So you see steps. So the imam climbs up those steps, and standing higher up, that's where he gives the sermon. That's where he leads people to prayer. So the purpose of the minbar is simply to elevate the preacher, the imam, so on a higher level, so the whole congregation can see him and he can project his voice much more easily over, as I said, the entire congregation. Now, what else do we have on the wall surfaces? Again, we have a lot more two-dimensional patterning. So we have various stripes around the minbar. Again, the white, the red, the white, the green, the white, the red, the white, the green. And then we have a horizontal zone up above with script that is against a field of vegetation, leaves, and vines. So we saw many of these things, even going all the way back to the Umayyad, but now it's becoming much more sophisticated, more refined, more delicate. The contours and the edges are much cleaner as after 100 years, after 200 years of this aesthetic, you have many more craftsmen who are not only excelling but are becoming internationally renowned for their ability to decorate these very important spiritual buildings. So we actually have records that during the Fatimid period, you have artisans who literally are moving. They travel from country to country, from major city to major city, as new mosques are being built, new cities are being built. The Fatimids are building new capitals. So you have groups, studios of companies, if you want to call it that, of expert craftsmen who actually are able to export this sense of Islamic beauty. So really what we're looking at today is just a continuation of that decorative mentality. So with the Fatimid, as well as other things we're going to see today, we're simply looking at luxury objects that embody much of the best of the best of Islamic design. So during the Fatimid period, one of the things Egypt was best known for was rock crystal. So rock crystal is mined. It's like a type of glass that you mine out of the ground. Egypt had a tremendous amount of it, and it was used very extensively during this period around the year 1000. And here you can see that rock crystal is then carved and used as the body of this or this vase. We saw urs made out of metal in the Umayyad period as luxury objects for the liturgy, for prayer, for the priests, for the imams. Here we see it in a more luxurious fashion in carved glass. So again, it is the vine scrolls, it is the animals. We call it an inhabited vine. Again, that goes back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So it's a very Mediterranean concept of the inhabited vine. But here, obviously, it also has a reference to the larger paradise imagery of Islam. The base of it is beautifully decorated. Again, the sense of warm and cool colors, very abstracted elements of vines and flowers. That continues on the spout of the vessel at the very top. And even when you look at the handle of the ur, the top of it even looks like it has a horse head. So whimsical, very creative, very expensive, a very dedicated and professionalized craftsman class that would have produced exceptional objects such as this. And here's another example of rock crystal. So again, it is a solid block of mined crystal that is then carved. The inside has to be hollowed out so it can hold liquid, and the outside in this case is a very abstract lion type of sphinx form. Again, it's Egypt, so you would have a lion sphinx type hybrid. On the handle, you see a little animal at the top, looks like some sort of gazelle, and other vines and flowing elements. You can even see that this rock crystal vase pitcher, P-I-T-C-H-E-R pitcher, is standing on a very elaborate base. And that base has these feet on it, literally feet, and little figures with big wings. So it shows a level of sophistication that was very rare around the year 1000 in the Mediterranean world. So we saw the rock crystal of Egypt. So now I'm going to show you other beautiful luxury objects. For those of you who may know, Syria was extremely well known for its metalwork. So Egypt was rock crystal, Syria was metalwork, and even many centuries later, people refer to very high quality steel, high quality swords, high quality metalwork as being Damascene, meaning coming from Damascus. So Damascus and Syria generally, Aleppo not to such a great extent, was known for metalwork. I'm showing here, if you can figure it out, it's a canteen. It is an object someone would have carried to hold water. So you have like a canteen for camping now, a large circular body, and there in the top right corner you have the spout and the stopper. So that stopper goes in and out to put the water in and to lift it up in order to drink the water. It's hor vacui, so we've had that many times before. Every square centimeter is filled maximally with decoration. But what is the decoration? Again, you have to think this is about 1100 AD. The imagery on this object is Catholic. In the middle circle, we have Mary with the infant Christ. Then, surrounding it in a borderline, we have Arabic script. Then, in the larger zone around it, we have more images of the early life of Christ. So in the upper right, right underneath the stopper, is the story of the manger, the birth of Christ. We see the ox and the ass in the manger. We have the angels, we have the three kings, and we have little baby Christ getting his bath. If we look at the top left, like at 10 o'clock in this image, you have like a little building with a dome at the top, and that is Christ's circumcision. So these are episodes from Christ's very early infancy. Okay? And at the very bottom, from the way we're looking at this, the bottom large scene is the flight into Egypt. That as Herod decreed that all small Jewish male children should be killed, Mary, Joseph, along with Christ child, went to live in Egypt for several years until those threats were over. And then between these three large scenes, we have these circular zones that are simply the vines and the flowers and the leaf forms. We saw at Mashada, We saw it in Umayyad, we saw it in Abbasid. And then around the farthest edge, more Arabic script. It's a very strange hybrid. But you remember that there is one God, Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. They also respect Christ as a prophet. So the fact that Islamic artisans would be interested in the representation of Catholic imagery is not so far-fetched. But there's another angle that many people bring up. Being that this is 1100 AD, these objects were also made for the international market. And as you know your history of about that time, we have the Crusades, where the Catholic rulers of Western Europe started to amass large armies to march on Byzantium, on Constantinople, march into Syria, march into Judea, in order to free Jerusalem from the clutches of the Saracens. So many people believe these were created as very expensive tourist souvenirs for the Catholics to take back to Europe. But it's extremely beautiful, and you see that there is no issue with that synthesis of Catholic and Arabic, Catholic and Islamic in one object. So we talked about appropriation, and artists can very easily transition from one tradition to another tradition. These visual elements are very interchangeable. You can mix and match them. There isn't a sense that Catholic imagery is of the devil, or that there is some evil or improper implication to using something from a Catholic society. And these objects beautifully represent a sense of ease and comfort in creating this eclectic mix. So here we have Mary with Christ. Joseph is on our right. And then we have another figure on the left. Not exactly sure who that is, with a couple angels above and a couple angels below. And here we have in better detail the script in Arabic that goes around them. Now, obviously, there is no bone and muscle structure. There is no biological focus in regard to proportion. There is no mass here. This is metalwork. So as you can see, it is incised design, meaning you have a sheet of metal and you are literally with your burin, you're engraving into the metal and creating those lines and cuts that become the outlines of the figures and become the internal lines that represent like eyes, nose, mouth, and wrinkles of clothing and details of the throne. So it's very shallow engraving into the surface. Obviously, at several different points, you also have the introduction of gold and silver in order to enhance the object and make it more commercially viable. Here we have another example. This is, upside down on the far right. You can see the stopper. It's still a canteen, but on the far right, there is your stopper. So now we're looking like the bottom side of one of these objects. So it is literally covered all the way around with various images that combines east and west. So if you look very carefully, obviously it's upside down. So the zone, the horizontal zone in the bottom of the slide, various figures in vines. So the inhabited vine. Some of them are playing musical instruments like bells, harps. Some of them are like weaving and doing other craftsman type trades. The next zone going upwards, it's upside down because we have reversed the object in the image. And here again, we have various animals and peoples in a parade. So there is some whimsical elements here. It is fun. It has a good sense of humor, uh, and obviously uh, the utmost in technique and sophistication. In this example, we actually see warriors, soldiers, on their horses. It looks like they have their weapons. They're doing jousts as they move around that circular hole. Now, again, the bodies are reduced to basic geometric units. Uh, Again, if that is simply because they love abstraction so much, they love geometry so much, that it is more beautiful than realism or naturalism with all of those scientific elements. But by reducing the humans, by reducing the animals, by reducing the weapons, by reducing everything into these shapes, it creates a beautiful pattern of light and dark over the surface of the object. So all the figures are in this silver, bright, shiny, polished silver tone against the dark black background. So it's the same thing as in the mosque we started with, where you have the contrast of light and dark, where the light projects outward, is more dynamic, represents animation, and it's juxtaposed against the dark of the background, of the shaded area, of the negative space. So you can look at this image either in terms of a narrative and its people, what are the people doing, how are the people dressed, what are their vahanas, what are their vehicles, or you can simply see it as a beautiful rhythmic pattern of silver, curled, arched, flower petal shapes against a dark black background. So here we have, I would call it a bowl of the same type of work. And again, various images of people on horses. Some zones are just abstract patterns. Some zones are like mythical creatures, a lot of vegetation and inhabited vines. And at the very top there, you have a baby in a basin with a mother and someone behind. I don't know if it's Christ or some other narrative that's being represented. But beautiful silver work, silver inlaid against this bronze bowl. We also have from Syria these beautiful glass vases. They are originally meant to be lamps. So they would be the oil lamps that would have been within a mosque. So they could be suspended from the ceiling, hanging down, transmitting light from above, or they could be placed on floor chandeliers, floor torches, and raised up higher. But again, the beautiful sense of contrast, the blue paint against the glass itself. You know, the glass isn't perfectly clear. The glass has a sense of color to it, a beige, tan color to it. But the blue against that tan, the blue and the red against that tan, the various handles, the little curls that come out on the sides painted in gold, that's where the ropes or the chains would have been connected to it in order to suspend it from the ceiling. So that was Egypt, Syria, the Eastern Mediterranean. But as we saw at the beginning of this lecture, we're also going to discuss what happened to the Umayyads back in Spain, their last refuge. If you remember, in the United States, we know some of these things. I don't know how well known or how much it is within K through 12 education in Armenia, but the Muslims invaded, conquered Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, in 711. and they were in Spain until 1492, actually the same year that Christopher Columbus sailed to America. We're only going to look at the early phase, the Umayyad phase in Spain today, and obviously one of the greatest monuments that exists in Spain, the most beautiful and most fascinating Islamic mosque in Spain that is in the city of Cordoba. It was an active mosque until the 1200s when the dynasty that was ruling, the Umayyads, fell apart. And this little area became part of a larger Islamic caliphate throughout the Iberian Peninsula. The mosque itself was begun in 785. And as you see from the outside, it just looks like a very blocky structure. Again, the fortress mentality, very, very thick walls. You can see on the top, on the skyline, those little points, those little crenellations, those little pyramids, triangular forms, just as we saw in the Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo. So it's all the same. Now, this monument is so fascinating because of the issue of appropriation. When we look at the right wall, from where we're looking, that right wall, you have a series of arches. Those arches are a copy of Roman arches of an aqueduct that is very, very close to Cordoba. So that's number one. They appropriated that semicircular arch and the concept of 3 stories of arches that comes from Roman aqueducts. Okay? Now, the other wall that is facing to our left. Here we can see a series of doorways. Those doorways would have been, there actually are rooms in there. They would have been commissioned by various guilds. So like various artists, various craftsmen would gather their funds in order to help pay for the elaboration of the building. So there's a little more variety, more individuality in the structure because of private donations and communal donations over time. So here we see one of those doorways. So the door is rectangular, but then we have the arch up above. It doesn't look like the arches we saw elsewhere in the Abbasid and Umayyad. This type of arch is called a horseshoe arch. It's more that broader arch that tapers a little in at the bottom. It's more than 180 degrees. We're used to a 180 degree semicircle. This is a little more like, I don't know if it's 250 degrees. It's not really 270 degrees, but it comes a little further down at the bottom and almost closes in. Then we have, a rectangle, a square around it, and up above we have these horseshoe arches that are like overlapping each other. So you see one large horseshoe arch, another one with one overlapping it by 50%. So again, you have a simple shape, you have a simple design, but there's an infinite number of possibilities. Then to the left and to the right, look at those arches. It's not a nice horseshoe. It's not a nice semicircle. It's more like a, I don't know if you want to call it a seashell, or more like a flower with multiple petals, or a clover. And then up at the top there again, you have your little fortification, pyramid, ziggurat type shapes. The color and all the decorations we've seen are simply decoration. It's applied ornament simply to make the wall surface more animated, more visually interesting. So here we have a detail. So you can see the columns. Where do the columns come from? They're Roman. So much of the building material for the mosque at Cordoba had come from previous buildings in southern Spain. So it's borrowed columns, then you have the horseshoe arch, then you have carving into this very light stone of this floral form. Then you have what looks like your Armenian tooth stone, volcanic stone, that gives a very strong color contrast. So you get that red against the whiteness of the stone. So a lot of the patterning that you have on these buildings is because of the use of color contrast in these various elements. And I don't know how closely you can see, but within that arch, can you see the swastika? They're like swastika elements. In the middle, there's one at the bottom center, and then you have a diagonal line and another one up above it. So again, this infinite permutation of various verticals, horizontals, diagonals for a sense of almost like lace, especially with the bright white of that carving against the darkness of the shadows within. So it does have that sense of a look of lace, the positive and negative. Okay, here we have the aerial view of the building. If you go all the way at the bottom, that is the corner where we were standing before. So on the right, you can see like the 3 levels of Roman semicircular arches that represent a Roman aqueduct. And on that bottom left corner of that block, you have those very fancy doorways commissioned by the various guilds and communal organizations. So in this slide, you can see most of that building is covered. Relatively less of it is open courtyard. So if we start at the top, there's your minaret. Your minaret is in the wall, as we saw with the Abbasid. The minaret is embedded within the wall. The minaret here is squared. Okay, we don't have the spiral. We don't have the spiral at this time in Umayyad in Spain. So we have our open courtyard. You can see in the slide, you have your columns, you have your shaded area, the repetition of that arch over and over again, a sense of mathematical unity and repetition. But then you see all that area that is covered. What do you see in the middle of that covered area? You have all of these like rows and rows and rows. And what's in the middle? It's a Catholic church. So in 1236, when the Muslims left Cordoba, the Catholics just took it over. So the Catholics made it into a Catholic church. So talk about appropriation. So the Muslims took building materials, took Roman building materials, took a Christian city, took elements of a Roman aqueduct, built their mosque, and then when they leave, the Catholics take it over and make it into a church. So everyone appropriates. So here we see the church that is now within the mosque. And it is an extremely typical, conservative, traditional church design. So here we see on the left and the right are the choir stalls. There in the center, we have the large altar. You have all the paintings of Christ and Mary and everything else, obviously. So since from the 1200s onwards, this has been in full operation. Then here's a full view of the altar as we look upwards at the various levels, from the altar through the various paintings as we ascend up to the summit, and the windows bringing light in. As we saw in the previous slide, that the Catholic Church is higher in elevation, taller than the areas around it, so that natural light can enter from up above. All right, so that is the Catholic part that was remodeled after the 13th century. But this is what's around it. So literally it's a Catholic church in the middle of a mosque. So you have the large open assembly prayer hall surrounding the church. No one prays in the mosque area. It is now more of a museum, one of the most popular tourist sites in all of Spain. But it is beautifully maintained. It was never destroyed. They never destroyed the Muslim mosque. They never destroyed any of the columns, any of the decoration, because not only is it stunning, but also because they could still use it as a place for the congregation to meet. So in Cordoba, it is simply, you saw how large the covered area was from the aerial view. It simply is a forest of columns. You go in and it's just like this. It's just on and on and on forever. All of these columns holding up semicircular arches going on and on forever. When you walk in, you don't know where the Qibla wall is or where the mihrab arch is, because it's just a sea of columns. Now, the columns themselves, look at them. They're ancient Roman and Catholic medieval. So as we have seen previously, they are using Christian buildings or dismantled Christian buildings in order to have the architectural elements that they could appropriate for this building. As we saw outside, it's more of a horseshoe arch than a European semicircular arch. It is slightly curled in at the bottom. And like we saw on the outside, to create dynamism through color contrast. So on the outside, we saw the white stone against what looked like brick or tufa of an orange-reddish tone. They continue the same color scheme on the inside of the mosque. So you can see it's like 2 stories of columns. It's very patterned. Many people refer to it more like zebra stripes because everything is striped. It is extremely animated. So we're looking in another direction. This one actually, we're looking back at the entry door. You can see the entry door at the far end. But it's this beautiful sea of columns and arches and red and white stripes. Remember, have a row of arches above another row of arches. That's like the Roman aqueduct. So just adoption of previous concepts. So in art history, we have appropriation that is political. It is a political, not stealing, but it is a political adoption of other cultures' elements for your own symbolic political narrative. So adoption is you just take. You're using what is already produced. The other term we use in art history, so we have adopt and we have adapt. So A-D-O-P-T and A-D-A-P-T. When you adapt something that is historical, you learn from it, but you put a spin on it, you translate it, you manipulate it into something that's maybe more relevant or more individual or more unique to yourself. So we can debate, are they just adopting, just stealing without any manipulation or additional artistic value? Or are they adapting, taking what they've observed from other cultures and then making it their own? So we could just look at these images forever. It's just mind-boggling. It's hard for me to explain. When you eventually go to Cordoba, you'll see it. It's very disorienting inside. You don't know which direction to go. It's almost dizzy in terms of you get so caught up in it, and whether you look to the left, to the right, forward, it's all the same. Now, because the covered space was built over different centuries, they didn't build the whole thing at once. There is a slight difference in the columns from section A to section B, or the shape of the arches from section A to section B. But overall, it is just this repetition, infinite repetition in a variety of directions. Finally, you find your way to the Qibla wall, and here we are getting closer to the Mihrab arch. Remember, the Qibla wall is facing Mecca. The Mihrab arch helps to focus your attention. It is a visual element of emphasis. So here we have a contrast of color. We saw the arches were more red and white. So here we have more of the golden and brownish shades. You can see in the various frames around the doorway, you have your Arabic script and the horseshoe arch. And overall, a lot of those vines and the plants and the abstract simplification of these natural forms. So when you get in there, when you're standing in front of the Mihrab arch, you look up. And there you have your dome. Remember we said there's quite often a dome by the entry doorway to the assembly hall, and there's a dome above the mihrab arch because that's places of emphasis. So here when you look up, again, it's this beautiful interweaving, interflowing of various movements of arcs and curves, and the top of the dome, when you're looking straight up, is more of that scallop, seashell, floral, flower petal type of element that is filled with abstract design and gold. And then you have it on these interweaving lines that are above and over each other throughout the ceiling around the windows. Okay, so here we have another detail deep into the center of the mihrab arch, and as we can see, the vines, the positive, negative, the light versus dark. White is used to give that little edge. We talk about edge shading as something a little dark to give a sense of moving around a corner, that three-dimensionality with a little shade around the corner. There's some white as edges, and that white edge around flowers and vines and various elements makes it pop out more. It's more of a visual element than a issue of mass. Here we see another image as we are in the more holy areas of the mosque. So double-tiered columns. And again, this is from a later date. It's much more elaborate. But again, that positive, negative, that sense of lace. Wall surface versus a void. Wall surface versus a hole. So we have solid versus empty. And that empty, though, becomes a visual element itself. It becomes that black contrast to the light gray and white of the actual stone surface. But that horseshoe has become the scalloped, curled, very organic form. This is, again, another representation looking straight up at one of the domes. So when various rulers kept building onto the mosque, building more and more areas, they would continually add another very fancy mihrab arch and sacred little space As the mosque became larger and larger, it's a tremendous size. As the mosque became larger and larger, you need many more of these necessary elements for the faithful, for the congregation. So today, just to give some sense of scale, there are 19 aisles, okay? And even today, it is the third largest in the world. So from Umayyad, Spain, around Cordoba, we have some ivory little boxes that, like the Fatimid rock crystal or like the Syrian metalwork, represent the height of visual sophistication. So it's inhabited vines, as we've seen before, horror vacui, as we've seen before. Some of these have religious elements, some of them do not. Sometimes it's just paradise imagery of plenty and fertility and lushness. So when you look at, because there's Arabic script on these objects, they are mostly about paradise imagery. So some of the creatures may be mythical, like griffins or sphinxes, or it may just be very mundane and very normal. So here we see a musician standing in the middle with two people seated left and right, listening to the music, with two lions underneath. There's a griffin or lion with wings on the bottom left, and it looks like maybe a unicorn or some sort of mythical type of gazelle or deer on the right. You have a couple of falconers, hunters with falcons. You have birds, again, inhabited vine scrolls. On the top, you can see a couple lions. It's really a very beautiful and obviously expensive object. And here, some lions attacking other animals. Are they calves? Cows? That's what it looks like to me. On the bottom left, it looks like two guys were wrestling. On the bottom right, again, some of those griffin phoenix type of creatures. I can see an eagle on the top left. Maybe a falcon, top right, maybe a falcon on the left. So these are objects that would mesmerize the population. I always try to reinforce that we're talking 1,000 years ago when there was very little for visual culture for everyday people to experience. We are jaded by television and movies and videos and everything on the internet. Clothing, fashion, stores, consumerism has fueled industries that cater towards the visual entertainment, the visual excitement of the consumer. Back 1,000 years ago, if you were living in these places and a majority of the people, obviously there's no electricity, there's no running water, there's no visual entertainment, there are no magazines, no books for the common person. So when you would walk into a mosque or walk into a church, there was this sense of visual spectacle where you were absolutely awestruck, dumbfounded by this splendor. And the fact that those religious spaces were so different from your everyday existence made them even more spiritually powerful. So the outside, the elaboration, the outside of the mosque that we saw here in Cordoba, the decoration of a minaret, the decoration of those arches, the use of those fancy columns, the sense of the red versus white creating that zebra striping effect on the arches inside of the building. All of that was just so over the top. It was so spectacular. It was like, for an American, we would say it's like living in Las Vegas. It's like entering Las Vegas after you've lived on a farm in the middle of Iowa or Nebraska for your whole life. There's a sense of being overwhelmed. And that obviously was used very well by, Catholics in Europe or Muslims throughout the Mediterranean world as a way to emphasize the heavenly splendor of the that's offered by the religion. So an object like this would have just had someone spellbound for hours. Something as intricate, something as beautiful, something as the symmetry, the balance, but also the uniqueness of every single little element there. There's a sense of absolute wonder. So here's just another luxury object. Again, we call them an aquamanile. They were very special water containers, aqua, water. Popular in Europe and the Middle East for ritual. These are obviously luxury objects. So like the figures we saw carved on the surface of those ivory boxes, it is this composite creature, part horse, part eagle, part bird. I don't know how you want to interpret it. The feet of a lion. So not only is that beautifully creative, but when you look at the surface decoration, the elaboration of each of those feathers. He also has Arabic script, almost like going across his torso, on those curved areas of his, his hip line, as well as where his front legs join his torso. We have more of these inhabited vine scrolls and creatures. Every, I don't say square centimeter because he's much smaller than that, but every little space is filled with a need for ornament, that need for elaboration. But it's done well here. It's not overdone. It's not over elaborate. It is not too fussy. It's done with a sense of good taste that I think works extremely well. The curve of those wings, beautifully they curve backward as a counterpoint to the outward curve of the animal's stomach or the curve of his hind part. There's some beautiful rhythms and echoes of curves and counter curves that make it, again, an extremely unusual and precious object. We also, another point I want to make, it still applies to southern Spain, that this religion began with desert dwellers. And desert dwellers are generally nomadic. They move with the herds, they move with the camels. There's a lot of migration. So therefore, desert dwellers generally do not invest in buildings and permanent objects because they want their wealth to be transportable. So in the Middle East, Central Asia is also true, whether we're talking about the nomads of the, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and so forth. There's a big emphasis on small objects, small precious objects that can be in someone's backpack, in someone's pocket. The Scythians were the same thing way back during the ancient Greek period. So that sense of the preciousness in the very small, almost like jewelry type of object is very much a part of the mentality. And that's what we're seeing being manifested here, that fussy, almost jewelry design concept as it elaborates these small objects, small luxury objects for personal contemplation and use. All right, so that is today's discussion of Fatimid and the Umayyads in Spain. Thank you.